This candle.
All right, let me prepare everything. And there's no need to make a countdown, right?
Nope, we're in. We're live.
Perfect.
Hello, everybody. Happy damn Friday to you guys. I'm pumped to be with y'all. I barely made it, but I'm here, and I'm pumped to be here. My buddy Rafa's here with me. We're going to have some fun. We're going to chop up some color grading. We're going to talk some DaVinci Resolve. Hope you guys are doing great. Hope you've had an awesome week. I've had a really good week, followed by an incredibly fun weekend last weekend for the Creative Color Science Masterclass. If you missed it, I definitely encourage you to pick up the recording. I think that they're going to make that available through TAC. We had an absolute blast, and we covered so much stuff. Way more, honestly, than I intended to cover at the outset. I'm going to take myself full screen here for a minute so I can yak with y'all for just a second. So we covered way more than I even intended to cover, and I think a lot of it came from at least a few of you guys who joined for grade school last week, where we talked about color science basics, and it seemed like at least a few of you guys got really curious about fusion and color science after that conversation. And you turned up over the weekend, and you gave me your weekend, and you asked some incredibly good questions. And you really dove into like stretching out your brain and the challenge of learning new skills in a new section of Resolve, and really the underlying concepts there. So huge high five to everybody who came out and joined me for that and helped make it special. And we, of course, wrapped it out on that last day with a conversation that I'm going to remember for the rest of my career, just because it was so exceptional to have three of my longtime heroes in one room, the Bogdanovich family. Mitch Bogdanovich, Jill Bogdanovich, and Corinne Bogdanovich, all in the room together. And we got to have a conversation that to me really embodied everything that I talk so much about here on the channel and in other outlets about the symbiosis of the creative and the technical, as opposed to, oh, am I going to do things technically or be a technical person, or am I going to do things creatively, or am I going to be an artist? Instead, thinking about how those things feed off of each other. And for any of you guys who were there, that was so evident within 5 seconds of hearing the interchange between specifically Jill and Mitch, who are daughter and father and colorist and color scientist, respectively. Because they were talking about how they developed the look for the Joker and how they worked on the creative as well as the technical agenda of doing a very traditional film emulation and really bringing that to life and best serving the creative needs of that film. Really exceptional conversation. So yeah, I'm so glad those of you guys who were with me were able to join. And if you weren't, definitely encourage you to check out the recording. And today we're ready to talk about some more color stuff. So I thought for today that we could talk about the things that are less, well, the term I usually use is foregrounded to us inside of Resolve. The stuff that's really powerful, the stuff that I like to use or that I find really useful, that doesn't like pop out the moment that we open a Resolve interface, because something else you guys have heard me talk about before that I'm a big believer in is that the way software is presented to us and the way the tools are presented to us and which are put first and which are put last, that actually changes our process. That changes the things that we more readily engage with, the things that we learn first, versus the things that we may never learn because they're just not that out there in the open for us. So that's what I want to talk about today, is the sort of lesser known aspects of Resolve that can be really powerful and useful, and how those things can be powerful and useful to us and how we can use them. So we're going to talk about that stuff today, and there's lots to talk about, starting with some really excellent questions that we got in response to our community post yesterday about what we were going to be discussing today. So I want to see if we can get to some of those. But let me kick it over to Rafa and see if we have anyone popping in with live questions yet that are good for this subject, or whether we got to start with a couple of those that we got on the community thread that we posted yesterday.
No live questions yet, but we can go to the community post. And for example, let's talk about the RGB mixer in a little bit of depth.
Awesome. Yeah, let's talk about the RGB mixer. And I was actually already talking about the RGB mixer today. So I promised myself to stay out of Fusion and of visualizing everything as 3D cubes for a little while, because those of you guys who were with me last week saw that we did a bunch of that last week. We were mostly on the Fusion page. And this last weekend for that Creative Color Science Masterclass, we were all up in the Fusion page and all dealing with color cubes. So we're going to stay away from that today, but I will say this. The difference between the primaries and the RGB mixer, for example, that's maybe the most concrete way to think about it. Is like, okay, well, what's the difference between, say, messing with my red, green, and blue offset or gain or gamma or lift or whatever here in the primaries versus when I go to the RGB mixer and I play with my red output, my green output, and my blue output? What's the actual difference there? So we could visualize that on a cube, and what we would see if we were to visualize it on a cube is that red, green, and blue in our primaries mean that we can affect the ratios of red, green, and blue in an image. So if I say I would like to have a higher ratio of, say, red to green and blue, I could do that by increasing, I'm going to say offset, by increasing my red offset, okay? This now means that my ratio of red to green and blue is different than it was a moment ago, right? Simple enough. What this doesn't mean is that I'm not changing the interaction between these colors. And what that really shakes out to is that I cannot really introduce hue shift using my primaries, because each of these red, green, and blue channels are sort of living in a tunnel. They're living with walls around them, so I can't change. If, for example, I wanted my red channel to be a little golder, that's something I can't really do. I can mix the colors here in the primaries, but I can't cause interactions between those channels. So if I wanted to get a little bit more of an overall gold, if I'm here in my vector scope and I drive my, say, my gain up toward the upper left, I might be getting overall more gold by introducing a bit more red and a bit less blue into my image, but I'm not actually mixing those channels together. If we contrast that with the RGB mixer, we can do really interesting things. Like I gave this example in a conversation I had earlier today when we were talking about, let's say, in my red channel, or better yet, in my, let's say, in the image that I'm looking at right now, I like the overall warmth. I don't necessarily want things to go any warmer than they are right now. And let me just kind of get my bearings here with what am I doing color management wise. Okay, I've got kind of some stock color management. Let's make it look like a little something if you guys are into it. So something like that maybe. Actually, I'll take it back. I'll leave that off. It'll make it easier to demo this. So I like the overall warmth that I'm in right now. But here's a good thing that I might want to do with the RGB mixer. I might want to say, I would like my warmth to be a little bit more of the red nature and a little bit less of like a yellowy warmth, if that makes sense. So what I could do in this case is I could go to my red channel and I could say part of the output for my red channel should include some of my green, like so. And that's going to be way too much. I wish I had a control surface handy for this. Let me just try it like that. Just a little bit is going to go a long way. But you can see now in the output of my red channel, I'm borrowing some of what's in the green and I'm pushing it into my red channel. And the RGB mixer, to my thinking, is kind of fundamentally more confusing, at least it can be. But the easiest way to think about the RGB mixer is to work backwards. So regardless of what these knobs do, we want to work backwards from whatever the hell we do with our RGB mixer, whatever we do with any adjustment in Resolve, generally speaking, we're going to have a red, green, and blue output, right? So it's simply a question of what we are concocting that red as, and that green as, and that blue as. So you can see here in the RGB mixer, by default, my red channel is made up of a very straightforward concoction of all of the input red, none of the input green, and none of the input blue. Makes sense, right? Green channel, none of the input red, all of the input green, and none of the input blue, and so on with the blue output, all right? So what we can do with the mixer, and in fact, this is the basis for making gamut transformations in color science, which we talked about last week. We change the amount of the input color that's present in the output color. So in addition to doing something boring, like changing my red output here, which is effectively the same as this would be the same adjustment. Like if I go to a 0.95 on my red output, let's just try an experiment here and grab a still. And then if I turn that off, do a new node, go to my primaries, go to my bars, and go to my gain, and go to 0.95, if I am thinking about this correctly, I should be seeing identical images, right? Because all I'm doing is taking my input red and taking 5% off of it on the output, okay? Now, that's something I can mirror in my primaries, so I probably would just do it in the primaries. But let's say in addition to taking some red out of my image, maybe I want to pay off the difference because you can see like I'm changing the signal around. What if I pay off the difference? I say 5% less red, but 5% of my green channel is now going to get rerouted into my red channel, if that makes sense. So something like this. Let's do it to a 5 and turn it on. So you can see it's a very subtle little shift that I'm making. I'm not really moving the overall mass of my signal as much as I am sort of compressing or biasing it toward more of a yellow vector as opposed to toward more of a red vector, for example. So there's that's a really brief intro to the RGB mixer. We are changing the amount of the various input channels that is present in the output channels. And so we could also, like if I increase this up like here, yeah, so really what I'm doing in that case that I just mentioned to sort of correct myself is I'm trimming red out of my red output channel, but then I'm adding some of the green channel into it. So I'm effectively increasing my output redness, but what that redness is comprised of is, or composed of, I should say, is different than what it was on the input. So it can be a really interesting way of correcting or creatively manipulating an image that's just different than our primaries. You're changing the amount of color that's present in the output channel by altering the ingredients that live within it, like so. So that's one interesting usage. And then I'll show you guys one more before we move off of the mixer, or at least look for more questions on the mixer. I can also do an interesting thing here. If I go to, I don't know, let's pick a new shot. Let's go to this guy. Let's reset everything. And let's go monochrome. So everything's going to go black and white now, all right? And you can see by default that changes my RGB mixer values to what are actually the default values for the way that luminance is derived by default in Rec 7 or 9, which is composed 71% or so of the green channel, and then the rest comes from the red and the blue. So that's for the geeks among us who want to know how do you separate colorfulness from luminance in an image? Well, Rec 7 or 9 says you do it like this. You could actually do it any other number of ways, and that's what we're going to do now. We can change around. Let me find a better image to do this on. Maybe this one that I was on is better, because what we can do here is within this black and white image, we can change the tonal weight of different colors because they started as color pixels. We can change their relative weight in the image. So if I, for example, you can see like as I drop or increase these different channels, I'm getting different results, especially like if we look at the subject's wardrobe here, the weight is going to drastically change here. The weight of the wardrobe, the weight of skin tone, the weight of eye color, it's all going to change. And this is kind of like a digital workup of techniques that have been with us for almost as long as filmmaking, where black and white films that were being shot to black and white stocks, they would actually put filters in front of the lens to change around the weight of these different color spectra that were coming into the film. And in doing so, those various colors would become brighter or darker. So for example, you could use the right filter in front of a black and white film capture and make the sky really dark and really moody by saying blues are going to get weighted further down into the mixture. So this is another really interesting use of the RGB mixer in this monochrome mode, where you could use this to develop a pretty interesting look and say, not only am I just going to do a boring straight up desat to get a black and white look, but I'm going to weight my luminance with a particular cocktail that sort of stacks or staircases the relative luminance of these different colors in my palette in a way that best supports my creative agenda. And then if you wanted to get fancy on top of that, you could do a layer node, and you could go into your key output gain and say, I'm going to do everything that I just did. Let's say that custom cocktail of RGB mixer in monochrome mode perfectly reflects my creative intent, but now I still want to have half of my original color. Well, that's what I'm getting when I say 0.5 with my key output gain here. Or I could do that even more simply and just go to the key output gain on this node and do half of it, like so. So a couple of ideas and usages for the RGB mixer for you guys. What else we got out there?
All right. Let's go to, for example, the color compressor and chromatic adaptation.
Yeah, okay. All right, what can I tell you about these things? The color compressor, we're going to explore together. This is not a tool that I use normally, which it's not one that, it's not like on my no-fly list or anything like that. It's just one that I haven't happened to encounter much need for. The idea behind the color compressor would be, let me see if I can find a good shot as an example here. The color compressor, if we think about, if we go to an image like this where we have a good range of hues, and now let's go ahead and drop a look on here so that we can let's at least get some contrast on here. So I'm going to go gamut free here, but we'll get some good contrast. We can see some nice, clean, separated vectors here on the image. We're going this way, we're going that way, we're going that way, we're going that way. Some really articulated vectors or hues in the image. That can be a desirable thing. It can also be desirable to bring sort of forked or really separated hues closer together. Imagine for a moment that I was actually looking for this a moment ago and just couldn't really find it. Imagine you had a shot in which your subject had a little too much variation in the color of their skin. So in parts it's like quite ruddy and warm, and in other parts it's paler. And you kind of want to homogenize your skin hues a little bit. Color compressor would be an interesting candidate for doing such a thing. But let's say in the case of a frame like this, I would like to sort of bring everything, like this green that I'm seeing here and this redder kind of flesh color that I'm seeing here, not all the way on top of, but into closer alignment with this yellow vector that I see down here. This is something that I could use the color compressor for. So let's pick a target hue, which I'm just going to do by taking my eyedropper, and I'm going to look for where this yellow vector is represented in my pixels, and that's probably going to be, like this M&M here. Okay, and what I can do from here is compress things toward that hue. So what this is going to do is look for hues that are within a particular range of that original hue, that target color that I've pulled here, and it's going to try and smoothly bring those toward that target. It's actually going to try, it may actually be targeting everything globally. I'm not quite sure, to be honest with you guys. I would have to do a little more research. But that's the idea there, is that we could use the color compressor to bring things closer. And here's kind of where I will make a suggestion about the usage or non-usage of this tool. The color compressor is, to me, even though, as I said, it's not on my no-fly list. It's not like, oh, that's a bad tool or it does bad things. I don't feel that way. But the color compressor belongs to a class of tools that has many members inside of Resolve that the user that it most appeals to is the user who doesn't understand how to get these results themselves. And the only user who really should avoid the color compressor is the user who doesn't know how to get these results themselves, if that makes sense. So once you understand what it's doing and if you happen to like it, there's no reason you shouldn't use it. But what I would say, and what I think my friend Walter Volpato would probably echo to us as he shared when he joined us a couple of weeks ago, is that really part of having mastery and exerting control over our craft is understanding at a pretty basic level what we are doing when we reach for a particular knob or tool. Doesn't mean we have to be able to code that tool up ourselves, but if we have a good sense of what it's doing, that's going to make us a much better artist and allow us to make much better grades for ourselves and our clients. So just by way of sort of getting familiar with what's happening here in the color compressor, and I'm just compressing hue right now, but you can imagine the same concepts holding for saturation and luminance, where if we imagine hue, saturation, and luminance as components or channels of the image that can have a great dynamic range, meaning a very broad distance between like the lowest and the highest saturation, or a great broad distance between the lowest and the highest luminance, all this compressor is doing, as the name would imply, is bringing the furthest two elements together, if that makes sense, bringing things into a smaller range. And we saw that that's what happened with the compressed hue as well, is we're looking at whatever that range of hues is. And to be honest with you, I don't know what the math underlying this tool is doing, if it's actually looking at the full 360 wheel and pushing everything toward this target color, or if it's looking at a particular, say, 180 degree subsection of the color wheel and grabbing any color within 180 degrees of the target and compressing those. I actually don't know what that sort of selection criteria is, but if anyone does, I'd be excited to learn about it. But what I want to do now is sort of rebuild this in a bit more of a manual way so that we can understand what's happening. So you guys who are out there following along, if you like, you can sort of think through this exercise in your minds for just a moment. What do you think I'm going to do if I need to, if I'm contemplating compressing my hues around a particular target? You can sound it out in the chat if you're a fast typist, or you can just think about it for a minute. I'm going to give you just a second to think about that, because a lot of the time you're not going to have an instant answer to these questions, but if you can think through them for a minute and arrive at them, that's really good exercise for your brain in general. But it's also like that time investment in like, wait, how could I do that? How would I do that? What are the actual underlying components or processes that are happening in something like a color compressor that's going to make you a better artist? I really do believe that. So hopefully everyone's had a chance to think about that for just a moment. And there's two things I could do here, but I'm going to show you the one that I might reach for first, just because it's been around longer. I'm going to use my hue versus hue. Okay. So what I want to do is I'm going to eyedropper my same M&M so that I can identify, okay, that's my sweet spot. That's what I'm aiming at. All right. And so what I would like to do now is around these goalposts, build additional goalposts so that I'm moving things closer to that range. And as we just said a moment ago, I don't know in terms of like the formula or the algorithm that's being, or the function that's being applied in the color compressor. I don't know how far reaching or narrow the selection criteria is for what hues will I be compressing toward that target hue. So we'll be kind of making that up or making a guess at it. But something that I might do if I wanted to do a sort of narrow version of it and say, all right, everything in like this pizza wedge right here, kind of in between this green vector and this red vector, anything that's in this slice of the pizza here, I'm going to push those hues so that they align sort of along this yellow vector, if that makes sense. So I've identified my sweet spot that I'm aiming at by eyedroppering here. And if I add some additional goalposts like so, and when I do these, I'm going to always be mindful to zero the hue rotation back out, because just by tapping on them with the mouse, you're probably going to move them. So I'm going to do that and undo that error that I made. And so now I can create control points in between these two goalposts and these two goalposts, if that makes sense. And in fact, I could probably even delete a couple here by hitting my control key like so. And now I can take, you can see I'm now grabbing the upper right edge of my pizza slice. So let me move this scope out for you guys. Sorry, I always forget my dumb faces there. So just to recap, because I mentioned it when I was hiding this vector scope, what I'm talking about doing is grabbing this slice of the pizza right here and compressing everything to this as my sweet spot. So I've got my sweet spot here, which isn't going to move. And around this, I wish to move things toward that sweet spot. So here out to the left of that control point, you can see I've now kind of bitten into my reds, and I have control over my reds. So if I grab this control point and pull it downward, I'm now achieving that. And let's go back to a more sensible view of our scopes. And I can do the same thing on this side. Tap a control point, and this one's going to go up. I'm going to be rotating in a positive direction. And it just so happens that there are no hues in here that are being rotated. My selection criteria, at least if I were wanting to actually grab this green vector, my selection criteria is a little too narrow. So what could I do there? I could open up the goalposts on this side, right? I could say, actually, if you're anywhere in this zone, you're going to get pulled. So I'm going to open that goalpost, grab my control point, and move it over. And now let's see if I have some more control. It's still not quite broad enough. So at a certain point, this becomes kind of an abstract exercise because I wouldn't necessarily advocate for a hue versus hue across this much range of the image. But for example's sake, you can see that I've now successfully bitten into my green section here, and I'm rotating it up toward my yellow. And if I turn this off and on, you can see the net result on this image. That's not particularly a desirable manipulation that I'm making here. It's kind of over exaggerated, but you can imagine, you know, like on the red side, that could be desirable. I could imagine that. And on the green side, maybe if I had hues more like here, that would be reasonable. But this would be one sort of manual way of rolling that compression using your own tools. And again, I don't say that because I think you should make life difficult. If the color compressor gets you there faster, great. But I do think if you're going to use the color compressor, you should understand how to do this yourself because it will make you use the color compressor better and more efficiently and to greater effect. So that would be a really brief tour just of the hue component of the color compressor. And we could have this same conversation about the saturation compression and luminance compression sliders here inside of the color compressor. But let's leave off there for now. And then just very quickly, let's talk about the chromatic adaptation because that's something we have discussed a bit more in the past here in grade school, but let's just take a look at it. So the chromatic adaptation tool is all about using chromatic adaptation, which is a like field of color science that's saying, hey, when I know that this image or this object looked this way under these lighting conditions, what is my best guess as to how that object would appear under these lighting conditions or with this different sensitivity of measurement device, whether that's a camera or a colorimeter or some other device capable of measuring light. That's what chromatic adaptation is saying, well, I know what it looks like under these lighting conditions, that it looks like this. So what can I do with that information? How can I best guess what it would look like under different lighting conditions? It's not an exact answer, but there are a number of different methods or formulas that have been devised for making that best guess. And you can see those represented here. CAD02, Bradford Linear, all of these are different methods for making a best guess about how would this look. This scene that might have been illuminated under, say, 5600 Kelvin, how would it look if it had been illuminated under 3200 Kelvin, for example? So it's all about changing our white point using the chromatic adaptation subdiscipline of color science, if you will. So you could use it if you wanted to change your display white point, like right now, if I wanted to go from a D65 to a D60 white point, I could do it like so. But you could also do it to change your scene white point. So in that case, I would say my illuminant type is color temperature, and I would say it's color temperature down here. And let's say I want to go from 5600, let's zero these out for a minute, down to 3200. So I'm now warming things by that amount. I'm changing the target illuminant of this scene underneath the same sensor conditions. So I'm still sensitized to 5600, but the underlying illuminant, if you will, is being changed to a warmer 3200 degrees Kelvin. So you can imagine lots of different uses for that. You could use it to make a creative white point adjustment. Like I might, there's actually there's a feature like this in ACES, but if we wanted to do a manual version, I could say after my 709 transform, which as you guys may know, targets D65, what if I wanted to target D60 for creative reasons, not for technical reasons? I could change my standard illuminant from D65 to D60 and just make sure that my color space and gamma are set appropriately for the display space that I'm working in. So that could work. I could also use it to relight my scene if I wanted to and say, hey, I want to see what this scene would have looked like if it had been lit instead of with a 5600 degree Kelvin source, what it would have looked like if it had been lit with a 3200 degree Kelvin source with no other variables being changed, with the sensor continuing to be rated for whatever it was rated for and with nothing else in my pipeline changing. So it's actually our scene color temperature. So boy, I feel like I got very excited and did a lot of talking right there, but that's some stuff for you guys on the color compressor and on chromatic adaptation.
All right, let's go to another tool. Let's go, for example, to the noise reduction tab and let's talk about the temporal, spatial, motion sections in the noise reduction.
Yeah, let's do that. So let's see if I have an actual clip that will play on my poor machine here. Probably not. Maybe one of these ProReses if they aren't just single frames. Okay, let's look at this guy. Okay. That's not the perfect example, but it'll have to do. So let's talk about noise reduction. So we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but the first thing that you guys may remember me talking about is noise reduction to me belongs to a category of adjustments that we should avoid for as long as possible, both in terms of where in our node graph we introduce it and how much we rely upon it when we are grading. Noise reduction it's important to know, again, going back to our idea of like understanding a bit more at the like ground level what you are doing when you break out a particular tool. It's really worth observing that noise reduction is damaging your image. It may yield a more desirable visual result because it's sort of smoothing out aspects of your frame, but it's damaging to your image. It's not ideal for your image. So you want to use as little of it as possible, and you want to hold off on using it for as long as possible, both in your process and in your node graph. That's my philosophy anyway. And if we look at the actual noise reduction tab over here, we have two varieties that Resolve offers to us. Spatial noise reduction means using adjacent pixels within every single frame, isolated unto itself, to smooth out noise, because we're kind of averaging things together. So if we zoom way the heck in here, this doesn't happen to be a particularly noisy shot, but we can see that we have faster, better, and enhanced. Your mileage may vary. I'd actually love to hear anyone who has a counterpoint to this. I never would use anything but better, personally. I think faster looks terrible, and I think enhanced only looks a little bit better than faster, but it does not look as good as better, to use confusing language to describe some slightly confusing names. So I would advocate for better, and then I would advocate for the smallest amount of your thresholds down here as you can get away with. So I'm just going to go all the way up to top floor so you can see what that looks like. You can see it's reducing the noise at the sort of like micro level, but if I zoom out a little bit, like the texture of my image has really changed. It's gotten softer and it just feels more sort of like plasticine than it did when I started, doesn't it? It's because it's doing its best, but it's still, you know, like it is damaging the image no matter how perceptually acceptable it may be. So that would be spatial noise reduction. And you can also play around with your radius. So generally the smaller the better. If you can get away with small, do small. If you can get away with, if you can't do that, do medium. And if you can't do that, do large. That would be kind of how I would think about those. And that, of course, just becomes another factor where on one conservative end, you have small radius, very small numbers like so. And on the other end, you're hitting it with everything you got. You're hitting it with a big, large radius, and you're giving it 100. That would be the extreme end of the spectrum, which I would avoid as much as I possibly could. So that's spatial noise reduction. Temporal noise reduction is an interesting animal, and I wish I had a longer and better clip to demonstrate this on for you guys. Let me update my cache directory because I don't think I have an active cache, and I actually would like to noise reduce this and then cache it off here. Let's see if my Finder will wake up for us. Okay. So we're going to go there. Let's turn this back on. Let's kill our spatial. Temporal noise reduction works differently, fundamentally differently than our spatial noise reduction. Temporal noise reduction works by analyzing whatever frame I'm on. So let's look at, I'm on this frame at 1 minute, 5 seconds, and 4 frames. Whatever frame I'm on, the temporal noise reducer is going to look X frames backward and forward, and it's going to stack those frames on top of each other, or I should say better, subtract them from one another. And it's going to look at what remains being the noise, is the sort of like inference that it's going to make. And then it's going to take that, what remains, that difference that was left over, and it's going to try to subtract it from the frame that you're currently on. So that's a fundamentally, pretty processor taxing process. And it can be interesting because it's actually not necessarily softening things spatially in the same way that the spatial noise reducer is. However, what you'll find is that depending on how many frames you set this up to, in your most exaggerated form, and motion estimation type, better is certainly going to be better than faster. Faster you kind of want to avoid, I would say, unless you're, if you're in that much of a hurry, like maybe you should pick a better time to do your color grade. Give it a chance to do a good job for you. Motion range, that's just a subjective call based on how much motion of objects within the frame and how much motion of camera is happening here. And then same thing here down below. You're just saying how much of this you wish to introduce. Let's go ahead and turn this spatial off. I thought I already did that, but I guess not. And so we can see here that we're going to start to get some noise reduction that way. And let's go ahead and cache this clip off so that we can maybe get some proper playback of it after a couple laps here. So you guys can see, again, not an ideal clip to audition because it doesn't happen to be particularly noisy. Oh, and it doesn't look like it likes my cache directory for some reason. Hang tight, guys. Let me just see why I'm not getting... I would love to see this play at speed for us if possible. There we go. So, tougher to tell on a shorter clip like this. But what you can get in extreme cases, you can get two things if you go too high with your frames and or with your thresholds down here. The first thing that you're going to see is a sort of like smooth motion type of effect like you would see on your parents' TV, where it's like, the football game is set to interlace at like 120 cycles a second. You can lose the 24 frame-ness of an image if you happen to be in 24 frames a second initially. And the second thing that you'll begin to see is because it is analyzing and making those subtractions, those differences of adjacent frames, well, to the extent that the frames move and then it's not a fixed subject sitting dead still in a chair and the camera isn't moving, Resolve may make some bad guesses in terms of that arithmetic when it subtracts one frame from another, and you can get artifacts. And let's just see if that happens if I crank it to 5 here and I hit it hard with these pieces. I'm just curious if I can sort of get a forced error, if you will, out of the temporal noise reducer. That'll take it a minute to cache off because I'm on a poor MacBook Pro and it's running OBS for you guys and capturing my camera and running the YouTube live. She's working hard over here. Oh, let me turn my scopes off. Let's give her a break, huh? Let's do this and that, and I bet we'll spin up and get speed, hopefully. Maybe not. It's just a little too much for us. And I'm not getting any artifacting in here, so that's nice. But you'll have to take my word for it. It's easy. The higher you go specifically with your frame count, the more likely you are to encounter artifacts where you'll see just a random, like, sort of, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like a sort of cubist, like, random shape that will blip across the frame for 2 or 3 frames because the difference between one frame in the next or one frame and 3 frames forward was too great to just subtract and get a noise pattern, but there's actually a difference in the frame contents that Resolve wasn't able to reconcile. So that's kind of a grand tour of like the mechanics of the noise reducer. And I sort of started off by talking about when I would and wouldn't use them. And I'll tell you guys something else interesting. One of the other places that I will use the noise reducer just as often as with noise is, again, I don't have a perfect example here, but if you're ever contemplating like playing with texture on someone's skin, for example, a lot of us may be familiar with the midtone detail knob for sort of smoothing out texture. If you're not, let's just see what that looks like. I should probably have people in my timeline who are something other than young and beautiful and porcelain skinned, because showing skin work is sort of a moot point in these cases. Oh, come on, Resolve, wake up. Come on, MacBook. I overwhelmed her. We're beach balling. While that thinks about itself and contemplates its existence for a moment, there we go. So let's go ahead and map this correctly into log C. And let's just say that we're, and I'm going to put a look on this just because I can't stand to fly without one for very long. And let's get some eye contact here. Let's go upstream. Let's go to our primaries. Come on, show me those peepers. Let me see some eyeballs. When this updates, what I'm going to contemplate is doing some negative midtone detail. That's something that you guys, many of you may already be familiar with, where it's going to give me a smoother texture to my skin. So there's off and then on, off, on. Might be a little tough to spot over YouTube. I'm going to go kind of crazy with it just so you can see. It's just giving me this kind of like soft, gauzy thing, which can definitely be nice for skin tone. But what I was going to drive at is, like, if you look at it here, I'm like, I don't love what that's doing to the texture of the image. Like, it may be solving a problem, like not on this, but if I had an issue with someone's skin texture being too coarse, this measure of midtone detail would probably solve that. But it would also give me another problem where I'm like, man, I really don't like that kind of like Vaseline-y vibe that I'm getting out of the image. So that tangent had a point, I promise, because one thing I will use the noise reducer often before I use midtone detail is as sort of a texture softener, either the spatial or the temporal variety. Probably start with temporal if I, yeah, that would usually be my first preference. And I mean just a baby amount of it, like maybe a 10. And if I turn that off and on, maybe let's go a little bit harder just for demonstration's sake. Yeah, again, it's tough because the skin is good here, but you can see the very fine detail sort of softening up just a little bit when I do that. Let's go all the way to 100 just to get the feeling. Like, you can see it tightly, like kind of loosening up just a little bit. But even at 100, like further than I would typically go with this, if I wipe to my midtone detail version and go full here, so there's midtone detail, noise reduction. I kind of like the noise reduced version better. So that's a great category of secret where it's like, all right, noise reduction, we're probably all familiar with that as an idea, but you can, in less of a measure that I'm doing right here, this is far too much, but especially in lower dosages, the noise reducer can be a really nice alternative to something like a midtone detail or a texture pop tool for softening things out like skin, but not making it feel as sort of like gauzy and dreamy as midtone detail can sometimes drive us toward. So some ideas about noise reduction. What else we got, Rafa?
Right, we got a question from Alexander Haugdal. What are some key factors in color response that you find aesthetically pleasing? For me, warmer white point, colder shadows, redness in skin, separation between skin and background. And maybe I want to add to this question, And how can we use some of the less known tools that you showed in the last minute?
Yeah, toward that agenda.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you answered your own question. You just rattled off a bunch of the things that I 100% agree. Those are pleasing. Like generally, even more than warmer whites or cooler shadows, because that stuff can move underneath. Like when I have split toning in general, like let's just go back to this frame and kill all this junk because I'm already in airy. You know, when I have split toning in general, which my colloid tool is giving me, and I just have to say, guys, for a couple of you guys, I do hear you when your comments come in that you're like, well, why don't you show us how to build this inside of Resolve? I have to be honest with you guys. If I could build it in 10 minutes and I could do it inside of Resolve, I would not have bothered with the DCTLs. I'm not looking to make work for myself. So I'm not being cute when I use this. This is actually a tool that I spent a lot of time designing to do stuff that I can't do with Resolve. So there are alternatives, and I try to demo those to you guys. And in fact, like my Building Looks series is a great primer on that, where that's, hey, all within Resolve. Here's some ways you can get at a lot of what I find pleasing in a creative look and what my custom tools are aimed at. But I just want to point out to you guys, I'm not like being cute or elitist. Like I have this tool because I need it. And if I could have designed it in an hour, I promise you I wouldn't have spent the last 5 years of my life doing it. And actually, while I'm on the subject, quick tangent, for those of you guys who did join for Creative Color Science, or those of you guys who didn't, coming up in just a couple weeks now is my Show LUT design course with color training, which I am just as excited about as this one that we just wrapped. It's going to be just as cool. It's probably a bit of a mellower entry point. We're not going to be doing any fusion or hardcore color science, but we are going to get some color science basics, and we are going to talk, as the name of the course implies, about Show LUT design. We're going to understand what LUTs are, what they're not, how they work, get a much better grasp on LUTs, which are one of the most powerful tools out there for accomplishing our creative goals, but they're also like really misunderstood, and there's a lot of like falsehood and half-truth floating out there around LUTs. So we're going to clear all that crud out of the way and really get a clear understanding of how LUTs work. And once we get into that, a big part of that course that we are going to be spending time on is look development inside of Resolve. So if you guys are really interested in doing look dev in Resolve, and you're committed to putting in some time to learning how to do it the best way you can, that would be a great place to begin. Because again, even doing look dev inside of Resolve and setting aside custom tools, I can give you some game. I can show you how to do some cool stuff. Some of that is discussed in my Building Looks series. But if you really want to get good at it, it's a skill, and it's going to take more than 15 minutes to answer a question or two on grade school. You should invest your time and energy, whether you take the course or not. Invest the time and energy in educating yourself through your own experience, or by asking more experienced people, or by reading on it. Whatever your avenue is, invest the time and you will see benefit. I also don't want to imply with what I said a moment ago that you shouldn't bother building custom looks in Resolve. You should build them and run into the walls of like, oh damn, I can't go any further with that because of this. And that's the logical jumping off point for something like a DCTL like I've built here. So big, huge tangent. But what I was getting at is desirable traits inside of an image, desirable aesthetics within an image. And we were starting with this idea of a warm white and a cool shadow. Generally a very good place to start. But what I find specifically desirable is the split tone itself, is the color contrast of pushing cool stuff into the bottom and warm stuff into the top, as you see represented here. So let's just do, I'm going to flop my output transform so that it's a little easier for me to see my individual color channels here on that graph. All right, so I'm going to go back over here. And if you look at my color channels, that's exactly what my custom tool here is doing, which again, you could, with enough time and inclination, you could exactly recreate this curve inside of your custom curves if you wanted to. There's a number of reasons why that's challenging and a number of reasons why you might not want to do that. But there's nothing prohibitive or elitist about what I'm showing you here. If you're really committed to not stepping outside of Resolve, not buying my tools, not learning the things I know, that's okay. You can get, with enough time, you could recreate this right inside of Resolve. But you can see within this, in the same way that the curves graph works down here, in the bottom, we're cooler. In the top, we're warmer, right? So desirable trait, as was observed in the question. But what's interesting is once I have that in place, and once I have that global characteristic in play, it actually doesn't really matter if I want to go for a super cool thing with my image here. Let's just do it with our temp for fun. Let's say let's go bottom floor, -4,000. And then let's go back to our tool and look at whether we like things with split toning turned off or on. Here is split toning at sort of like a stock unity value. Here's nothing. So we don't necessarily need, I would no longer characterize these highlights here as warm per se. They are warm relative to the shadows, or I could say that the shadows are cool relative to the highlights, but there's no objective sort of like judgment to be made that, oh, I have exceptionally warm highlights or shadows. It's really the relationship between those things that I find pleasing. It gives the image depth, it gives it contour, and it creates more color contrast. So a subtle distinction from the very good observation that was made that, hey, warm highlights and cool shadows are pretty tasty. You're absolutely right. But they can even be tasty. You know, like I didn't even go as far with this as I might go if my knob swung further. Like I could go nuts with it if I do some linear gain and really slam it and try to really get down here into this so that I'm like almost completely in this cool quadrant. I mean, that's starting to look really crazy, but what if maybe I really like it? Even here, if I change that split toning, it's still more fun to have on than off in my book. It just feels more interesting. So a fun distinction to think about, I guess I would categorize that as. And in terms of like other desirable image characteristics, you talked about some great ones. One that I would add is I'm kind of a princess about my toe. Like this is the shape I like in the toe. You know, like this thing, I'm not seeing a unity line here, but you guys can imagine my unity would be a straight diagonal from this corner to that corner. I like a toe that dips below that line, but then an overall curve that lives above zero so that we get these just slightly elevated shadows, which you can see here in my histogram. I've got these teeth that are living, there's a little gap between bottom floor and bottom of the image, if that makes sense. It's another thing that I find generally desirable, probably because it leads you to have the feeling of density and inkiness in the shadows, but it feels, even if it's not the case, it feels like there's still some life and some information in there. So I would add that to an already very good list of desirable characteristics in an image. Yeah, that's plenty on that. What else we got?
All right, let's go to color management for a moment. Scrallis wants to know if you can master with color management for Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 via color space transforms, and then flip to Gamma 2.2 for web delivery and be okay? Or does that need an additional trim pass adjustment?
I'll put it this way. In theory, like I always want to have a trim pass for any secondary targeted output. I never want to take it on faith. But because you're talking about such a slight difference, like the difference between a Gamma 2.2 and a Gamma 2.4 curve are so small, that first of all, yes, you can absolutely do what you just described and perhaps get better results for a web delivery, although there's a very complicated conversation to be had about ideal gamma character encoding for web delivery. But if you wanted to go with Gamma 2.2, it's probably going to get you closer than Gamma 2.4, and you're probably safe to flip that switch and hit the button and trust that it's going to look closer than it would have if you'd left it at 2.4. There may be shots where you're like, oh, I kind of wish I'd had eyes on that and I would have tweaked it. But in a pinch, I think that's a pretty good suggestion. Yeah.
All right. Another question, this time from Ferenc Zabados, something like that. How do you deal with different deliveries from the same timeline?
I assume we're asking about different color space deliveries, mastering for different spaces. So generally, what that's going to be is I'll sort of caveat this by saying that I'm spoiled in that like there is little to no consideration of online or like conform or final deliverables in my workflows. I am 9 times out of 10 delivering graded individual shots with handles, which are then going to be reassembled by an online editor somewhere else, either in a different system. Maybe that's Resolve, maybe it's Premiere, but either way, it doesn't really affect me. They're just going to take my graded shots and work with them. And if I were doing things differently, that might change my answer, because some of what I'm about to share with you guys may not be ideal for an online workflow. It may be different, but from a pure color perspective, the way that I would usually handle that is I'll just duplicate my timeline. And whether I'm doing my output transform at the timeline level, as you guys have seen me talk about plenty, or whether I've got everything, one concession that I will make to an online editor if I'm working with one and we're in, if we're in one project, I'll just make a group if I'm not using groups for something else. And I might make a group, like in this case, I would say like, I could call it whatever I want, like all, or I could call it like camera or negative, like something that says, hey, it's camera negative, it's going to need to be mapped. And that way I can put this output transform. I'm going to copy it, Command C, delete here, and I'm going to add it to that group post clip. And all that's going to do is that's going to mean that anytime there is the need on the online side to pull a clip out of that stack, for example, a graphic that is not in Arealog C and should not be transformed in this way, that just means they just need to make sure it doesn't belong to the negative group, and it's not going to receive the adjustment in the same way that it would have to if that final display transform was happening at the timeline level. So that's just a small workflow tweak. But regardless, I would do a separate timeline for every new pass, and I would, of course, have the display that I'm targeting in front of me so that I can evaluate what I'm doing. And I would change my targeting on my output. So if I'm targeting HDR, I would change that here, although in this group setting, I would need to create a second group. And I could call it, maybe this first group I would rename, and I would call it negative to 709, so that I know this is camera negative and it's for my 709 timeline. And then maybe I'll make a new group and I'll say negative to HDR. And now I'll make my own different color space transform and target whatever my parameters for HDR happen to be. That might be P3D65, ST2084, 1000 nit. And if I had like a Sony X300 off to my right, this image would look beautiful in HDRE on that monitor, and I could do my trim pass on this timeline for that output, and I would change my grades at the clip level if needed. I, of course, would expect things to be in a very good place overall, but I would just make little trims and perceptual adjustments as my eye dictates, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the workflow I would use for multiple outputs. And then lather, rinse, repeat. If you got to do 20 of those, just do a different group for each and a different timeline for each. All right, what else?
Okay. Question from Alexander Howdell. What do you think are the key attributes of the Arri Alexa color science that make most cinematographers prefer it? Are there aesthetic choices made within that pipeline that we can clue into our work?
Yeah, what a cool question. So here's what I would say about the Alexa color science. We want to sort of like separate things out into their own buckets, because there's a couple different pieces that could fall under the heading of Alexa color science. The first piece of Alexa color science is, and one of the things that I really do believe has helped Arri to sell a lot of cameras, in addition to having a great product itself. But the first piece in that bucket is kind of the most straightforward, and that's this. Right now, for example, let's ditch this group thing that I was talking about here just for simplicity's sake, and let's go back to having my display transform happening at my timeline level, okay? And one of the first things that I could say about Alexa color science is right now I'm transforming to Rec 709 from Arri Alexa log C using a formula and an algorithm that is actually, this is the OpenDRT project, which is really interesting and something we can talk about another time. It's another path for getting from scene space to display space, and actually a really exciting one. But if I went with something more vanilla, I could be doing it with a color space transform. Arri Alexa log C to Rec 709 Gamma 24, and then whatever other parameters I've sort of dialed in over time down here in the rest of the tool. The first place that I can identify Alexa or Arri's color science is here. I'm going to reset this. Let's actually grab a still of it. And instead of getting to 709 from Alexa via Arri's Resolve, or rather via Resolve's Color Management V2 solution, I could get there using Arri's solution, which is different. And it's also different than, say, Red's solution. If I look at, here's my 709 to IPP2. That's yet another solution. So the reason I point this out is because, first of all, there are different ways of getting from scene space to display space that are equally technically sound, and it's just a question of what works best for you as an artist. But that's the first thing that has helped sell Arri cameras, because if you want this is a total subjective take. I cannot prove this to you. I can't prove it in a court of law. But if you want my subjective take, Arri's solution for getting from their camera's scene space to Rec 709 looks better than that of most other camera manufacturers. Red's doesn't look as good. Sony's doesn't look as good. So that's really the first part, and it's really no more complicated than coming up with a better transform than some of the other camera manufacturers use. And just nulling out that variable, or say transforming Arri out to 709 using Red's solution, which you can absolutely do if that was your preference, that already makes for less of a clear advantage of Arri color science, quote unquote, over the color science of other cameras. So that's part number one. Part number two is this. There's a black box in between what a camera sensor sees, the actual spectral information that it captures when the light hits that sensor, and what is captured onto the hard drive on that camera. There's a black box in between there of manufacturer specific processing that is processing that captured linear light in a particular way with a variety of agendas. It's aimed at trying to maintain dynamic range. It's aimed somewhat at sort of bandwidth efficiency, because we would not want to or be able to capture every single bit and byte of information that hit that sensor. There's a variety of agendas and aims and methods that are employed in between light hitting the sensor and data being stored onto the hard drive. And that, by the way, is equally true whether you're shooting ProRes or so-called RAW formats. There's always some intermediate step of bayering or of storing that bayered information into a file format that is going to debayer and then tee into a pipeline in a way that results in a pleasing image. That's always a factor. So something Arri's doing in there works. That's about the best we can say, or at least the best I can say, because I don't know what's going on under the hood. I'm sure someone could tell me more than I know right now. But in terms of the way that signal is being shaped and sculpted and stored into its camera negative state, into the state that we are going to be dealing with it for the rest of our post process, something about it's working. Something about it seems to be working a little bit better than, say, what's happening in between a Red sensor and the point that it is stored. The way that colors approach the edge of the gamut that sensor can reproduce, it seems to be a smoother fall off, and maybe a more desirable, maybe more filmic, to use a loaded term, fall off with Alexa sensors and processing versus Red or a Sony or something like that. So I want to be scientific with my answer, and I don't actually know what's going on under the hood there, so I can't really speak to it. But what I can say is it seems, even when you null out that variable of the display rendering transform or of the scene to display transform, even when you set that aside, there's something better or there's less of something bad happening in between Arri's sensor and the point of encoding versus many other camera manufacturers. So that's a very long answer, but those are, I think, the sort of key components. And the other part of the question that was interesting is like, well, what could we learn? How could we borrow from that? I wish I knew more about what's going on under the hood with the ARRI color science there, because I think the answer is quite a bit. We probably could learn quite a bit about like, hey, whatever the shape of your saturation curve is, or however you are sculpting that raw data into something that, into the form that it takes at the head of my node graph, I'd love to know what you're doing, because then I could apply that to, in theory, the raw linear data from another camera if I could get to it in that state. That's not easy to do by a long stretch, but it is certainly possible. And you could have, if it wasn't like proprietary and specific to manufacturers, you could actually have dialogue, and you could have everybody improving the way that they do these things, because it's not discrete and hidden and proprietary to each manufacturer. So long answer, hopefully some interesting thoughts and ideas in there for you. And Rafa, let's do one more. Dealer's choice, something good to round us out for today.
All right, so I will. Maybe, for example, I don't know what to choose now.
Big decision time.
All right, let's go to Jalil Bourne, who wants to know if there is a way to emulate base grade, film grade, Baselight functions into Resolve.
Oh, that's a good question. I think there absolutely would be. I actually don't know. It's been a while since I was in Baselight, so I don't know the exact tool set that's in there. And, I would have to learn, get refamiliarized. Like, all right, what are each and every one of the base grade tools the tools in the base grade tool set? And then what's the math that's going on underneath there? And there's ways of figuring that out. There's ways of analyzing images and scopes and ramps and various charts and patterns. And you could probably reasonably infer most, if not all, of the math that underlies the base grades. Certainly, even more so if you target like, well, I really like that knob or the way these two interact. And you could build that out as math. You could do it as a DCTL. You might even be able to do it as a custom node in Fusion, which we did a lot of in color science class last week. But probably the simplest way in terms of deploying a dynamic tool in the Resolve color page would be to build a DCTL which doesn't just aim at mimicking the results, but actually reproduces the math that's being used in the base grade. So the answer is yes. And it's kind of like the answer with almost any project like that you might contemplate undertaking in color grading and color science. The answer is almost always yes. It's just a question of how much time and effort is involved, and how much time do I have and effort am I willing to expend. So the short answer would be, yeah, you just got to want it. Give me one more. Something short. I guess it's hard to predict. It's hard to find one that I'm going to answer briefly, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. That's how it works. And I was muted, so let me repeat the question. Let's go to what about using color chart in an ACES space?
Yeah, let's look at the color chart. Now, did we recently talk? I feel like we recently talked about the color chart.
Yeah, like a month ago or so, I remember a question like that.
Yeah, well, no harm. Let's do a quick recap. That's as good a place as any to end today. I'll show you guys the way that I would use the color chart in an ACES workflow. So let's build an ACES pipeline. Do I even have it in my stack anymore? No, ACES is on the outs with me. But let's do it. Actually, I'll do the proper ACES workflow. So we'll go CCT to 709, and then I will actually do another one at the head to map my Alexa into CCT. Okay. So what I would do here, if I wanted to use this color checker to calibrate my image and get a tighter match to what should have been seen by the camera versus what actually was, I would pick out, I already forget what chart we're looking at. All right, we got a color checker. I don't know exactly if it's a color checker classic or not. Let's say it's a classic legacy. It's important to know, but I don't actually know off the top of my head. Now, for my source gamma, the challenge here in ACES is going to be this. We actually can't target those things. These lists are sort of like annoyingly incomplete in here. And interestingly, if I'm remembering correctly, So I have ACES for my target color space, but I don't have the curve for my target gamma of ACES CCT, nor do I have it as a source. And what I really want to do is have a source gamma, and target color space that all belong to my working color space. So I can show you guys the way that I have solved this in the past, because the truth is, as long as I'm staying in one space, and as long as I'm in a sufficiently large space, it actually doesn't matter where I do this. So this is this is great that we asked about ACES, because now we're doing something I didn't demonstrate a couple weeks ago. Here's the way that I would handle this challenge. I would do this as sort of like, I would think of it as lab work that I would be doing at the very, very beginning of my process, even before I input map. And this is a good example of an instance where I actually want to have a section of my node graph that exists upstream of my input transform, and why I might want to do my color management in nodes. So stick with me for this, because it's going to be a little involved, okay? So as of right here, this is my input node. I'm going from Alexa to ACES CCT, right? Over here, I'm going from ACES CCT to Rec 709. That is forming my color management sandwich, or my pipeline, my sort of stock ACES transformations. But what I want to do now is calibrate my image against this color checker in a color space that is fully supported down here in my menus. And I want to do all that upstream before I even get into ACES CCT, for reasons that I can explain further some other time. So from experience, I can tell you the easiest way to do this when I'm in ARRI is to move into red, wide, gamut, RGB, log 3G10, and back again. So we're going to do something I, again, did a bunch of in our Color Science Masterclass last weekend. We're going to make a sandwich. We're going to say ARRI Alexa, ARRI log C, red, wide, gamut, RGB, log 3G10 to move into red space. No tone mapping, no gamut mapping, no white point. And I'll label this to red. And then we're going to do another transform here where we're going to do the opposite. We're going to say red, wide, gamut, RGB, log 3G10. And we're going to go back out to ARRI. So the net of what I'm doing right now is going to be nothing. I'm just going to be going to red, back to ARRI, out to C, back on dry land. So that after this node, what I'm feeding into my head of my ACES pipeline is no different than it was a moment ago. You can see when I flip this on and off, no change. But now I've got something I didn't have before that I needed. I need my image in a red, wide, gamut, RGB, log 3G10 state so that I can access my color checker in the way that I want. So I can now, on my gamma, I can say red log 3G10, because that's available to me. Target gamma, red log 3G10, also available to me. Target color space, red, wide, gamut, RGB, also available to me. Looks like I could probably do this same exercise using DaVinci Intermediate if I wanted to. No difference. It'll be the exact same thing. It's just a question of being in the proper state, representing that state to the color match tool properly, and then doing the work of color matching properly. So we've got our color checker legacy selected. I'm going to go to my drop-down menu, grab my color chart, and I'm going to fit my corners onto the color checker, like so. All right. And now, if the gods are with us and I know what I'm doing, and I go down here and I say match, I should find that I'm actually pretty darn close, right? And you can see I've only got a little bit of discrepancy here. But if I now turn this color chart off, you can see, and I turn this whole stack off and on, you can see this is the resolve color checker compensating for how these patches actually read by the camera versus how they should have read from the camera, like so. And it's all happening. I'm going to red and back to ARRI, and it's all happening before I even get into the head of my ACES pipeline, which, as I said, I'm happy to explain in the future if someone's really curious. But that's how I would use the color checker. And in particular, if I wanted to use it and I was in an ACES workflow, I would do it before ever getting into ACES. and I would do it by targeting, by moving my camera, the color space and the tone curve into something that's fully supported down here in these parameters, so that I can have a source gamma and target gamma that match, and a target color space that matches the actual color space that I'm in. I know that's a couple of steps, but that's the cleanest way to do that by my measure. We don't want to do any kind of source and target offset here. We just want to solve the problem within one color space, and then we'll deal with color space transformation or matching one color space to another in a separate node, if that makes sense. We want to keep this color match solution as simple as possible. Okay, guys. Lots of good stuff today. I feel like I did some longer form answers, and we maybe didn't hit as many questions as we usually do. And I still had some other ideas that I was going to share with you guys that I didn't quite get to. So we'll figure out a sensible next topic for next week, and maybe we can continue on this thread if you guys are still interested. Let me know in the comments from this, or in the comments on one of the community posts, if you do feel like, hey, let's just keep going down this thread. That'll be helpful to us as we plot out next week's content. And other than that, really glad you guys could join. Sorry for keeping you a couple minutes extra today. And I hope you guys have an awesome weekend, and go and make some pretty pictures, and use some fresh ideas when you're grading based on what we're talking about here. I'll also leave a link to the Show-Let Design course in the show notes if you're curious to go check that out. That's happening, I believe, the week of October 17th. I'll have to look. It's in about 2 weeks' time, and it's going to be fantastic. It's 2 full weeks of study. It's independent study for a lot of that, and then we're going to have a couple live sessions a week as well, including one where we'll be joined by one of my heroes, Mr. Josh Pines, another world-renowned color scientist, one of the smartest guys in the world about this stuff, and really one of the pioneers of implementing and using LUTs in digital intermediate workflows. So that's a conversation that we're not going to want to miss. Thank you guys very much. Thanks to Raphael for co-hosting with me, and I will see you guys all very soon.